Have you ever tried falling asleep while knowing that your Earth is nothing more than a vast piece of ice drifting in an endless tar-black ocean? It moves slowly, at a pace comparable to a pedestrian's step, yet inevitably, without fail. Beneath you lies not solid ground, but kilometers of frozen water. These words now sound familiar to us, yet imagine how different it must have seemed in the past. A drifting station, polar explorers, black and white photographs of bearded men smiling in fur hats. But let's rewind the film back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Back then, the very idea not just of reaching the pole, but of living on the ice, sleeping on it for months, seemed nothing short of madness. The first expeditions, such as those led by the great Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen, who deliberately froze his ship, the Fram, into the ice to drift with it, those are one thing. His ship had sturdy wooden sides, a cabin, a stove, but when Nansen and his companion, Hjalmar Johansen, began to trek toward the pole on foot, that's where the real challenge started. By 1937, our legendary explorers, Ivan Papanin, Ernst Krenkel, Petr Chershov, and Yevgeny Fyodorov had already landed on a thick ice floe with a resolute plan to spend many months there. Their home from the very beginning was temporary and mobile. Now imagine you are a polar explorer. An airplane has just taken off, leaving you and 3 comrades stranded amid the blinding white snow. All around there is only ice, nothing else in sight. The nearest land is 1,000 kilometers away. Your first task is to pick a campsite. How do you choose a floe for the night? This is not a place for a picnic by a river. A mistake could cost you your life. You can't just point at the flat one over there and say, "I like that." You need a proper ice floe. They looked for what's called pack ice, old, multi-year ice, not the young, fragile ice that forms over a single winter. That ice is as brittle as thin window glass. It's a traitor. What you need is ancient, seasoned ice, thick as 3 or 4 meters, ice that has survived many summers, hardened, solidified like granite. They walked across this white expanse, tapping their heavy ice picks, specialized tools designed for this purpose. Listening carefully? Yes, listening to the ice is crucial. An experienced polar explorer can distinguish a solid, reliable mass from a dangerous crack just by sound. They drilled holes, measured the thickness. Their goal was to find a flat area, big enough to set up camp, yet ideally close to some ice ridges, known as taros. These are heaps of broken ice, massive, jagged ridges formed when ice floes collide. They look terrifying, yet they provide excellent shelter from the fierce Arctic winds. The ice floe where Papanin's team landed was initially a giant, almost 3 kilometers long and 2 wide, a veritable ice runway. It seemed like the Arctic itself was a woman with a stubborn, uncompromising temper. And so the place was chosen, the tent set up. Inside they lit a kerosene stove, called a primus, boiled some tea, and prepared for sleep. But that's when the real challenge begins. Psychology. You crawl into your fur sleeping bag and listen, because the ice never truly falls silent. It lives its own life. First, it cracks loudly and dryly, as if someone nearby is constantly snapping dry branches. This is the sound of the frost contracting. Second, it clicks sharply, like a giant gun cocking, a sign of internal tension. Third, it groans low and prolonged on a single note. This resonates through the entire icy mass, the ocean beneath you, an ominous hum that makes the blood run cold, as if a whale the size of a train is slowly writhing underneath your tent's floor, and the ice itself seems to breathe. This is not mere figurative speech. Under the influence of tides, and even beneath the ice sheet itself, this colossal icy shell gently sways, almost imperceptibly. Welcome to Lectures Under the Moon with Daniel Hayes, where we explore the incredible world of polar explorers. This isn't seasickness. No, it's something much deeper. It's a constant, subconscious sense of unreliability. The feeling that the solid ground beneath your back isn't really the Earth, and at any moment, it could fall apart. The first nights for the polar explorers were torture. Let's consider what they feared most. Cold? Of course. 29 or 30 degrees below zero. It's no joke, but you can prepare for the cold. Clothing, sleeping bags, a tent. We'll talk more about that in the next part. Maybe a polar bear? Oh yes, that was a real fear. The ruler of the Arctic, an uninvited guest, which could arrive at any moment. It has an extraordinary sense of smell. It tracks the scent of food, smoke, of human habitation. And a canvas tent isn't a barrier for it. It's like a wrapper for a tasty meal. That's why a rifle was always ready at the entrance, and they slept very alert. But you know what was even scarier than the bear and the frost? The sound they called shifting. That's when your ice floe, your floating island, collides with another one. Or worse, when the ice field begins to squeeze together. It's not just friction, it's a screech. Imagine hundreds of trucks simultaneously dumping metal scrap on you. The sound of such power, it deafens your ears. The tent trembles. Frozen frost from the day falls from the canvas ceiling right onto your face. You lie in your sleeping bag, your heart pounding. And one thought runs through your mind. Will it hold? Or is a black water abyss going to open right beneath me? Sometimes, polar explorers would wake up to a terrible crash, jump out of the tent, and escaping from a fur sleeping bag in sub-zero temperatures is a whole story by itself. They'd see ice mountains rising 100 meters away. That's what's called breaking up. The ice cracks, shatters, pushes against itself, and you stand in your underwear in the freezing cold, praying that this chaos doesn't head straight for your tent. They said that initially, sleeping was simply impossible. They would wake up 20 times during the night from every loud snap. It seemed like the ice would shatter at any moment. And, looking ahead, I can tell you that once it did, right beneath them. So how did they manage to sleep at all? Humans are remarkable creatures. They get used to it. First, they would be so exhausted during the day that sleep overtook them. Working in the cold, whether taking scientific measurements or simply chopping ice for tea, drained enormous amounts of energy. By evening, all they wanted was to crawl into their bags and shut down completely. Second, they always had a lookout. Later, on stations, this became an iron rule. One person never sleeps. They sit by the instruments, monitor the weather, melt snow, and most importantly, listen. They listen to the ice, and if they hear that dangerous sound of an approaching shift, they alert the others. The mere knowledge that someone is awake and keeping watch gives the rest the psychological right to relax and doze off. Third, they learned. They began to understand the language of the ice. After a week or two, they could distinguish by sound what each noise meant. That's just the ice settling. That's nothing. That's a crack, but far away. That's compression, but weak. They learned to sleep to this symphony, just as we learn to sleep to the rhythmic clatter of train wheels or the rain outside the window. The first night on the ice floe wasn't about sleep. It was about acceptance, about coming to terms with your fear, convincing your mind that this creaking, drifting, icy world is now your home. And only then, as dawn approached, in a frozen sleeping bag amid the howling wind, would come the first anxious but life-saving nap. And here's where the question arises. How exactly did they sleep without turning into ice by morning? And what is a bag made from reindeer fur? We'll discuss that in our next segment. But now I have a question for you. one I promised to ask. What do a polar explorer and a cabbage have in common? Surprisingly, the answer is multi-layeredness. In the Arctic, survival doesn't depend on having one thick layer, but rather on being wrapped in numerous clever layers, much like a head of cabbage. And here's a follow-up question to tease your curiosity. Why does the warmest sleeping bag in an expedition smell, well, let's say, not like French perfume, but rather like an old grandmother's chest, or even a shed? Let's figure it out. We'll start with the home. We chose the ice, and now we need to set something on it. So, what is a polar explorer's tent? It's not that lightweight, pretty little tent we take fishing in July. Oh no. It's a fortress. The first explorers, like Nansen, when they went on foot expeditions, even used silk tents. Yes, you heard that right. Natural silk. An incredibly durable and surprisingly lightweight material. But for a stationary camp, for an ice drift station like the legendary Papanines, something more serious was needed. The legendary Papanine tent was an engineering masterpiece. It was designed, by the way, by the aircraft engineer Lavochkin. Outside, it was made of the densest canvas, treated with a special compound so it wouldn't crack in the cold. The fabric was so tough that wind gusting at 100 kilometers per hour simply slid off it, unable to break through. At the entrance, there was a special sleeve or tube, which could be cinched tight like a pouch. No zippers allowed. Heaven forbid. A zipper at -30 Celsius is just a piece of dead, burning metal. It would get snow and ice stuck in it instantly. Only ties and laces. But the most genius part was inside. Remember the concept of layers? The tent was double layered. Inside, at some distance from the canvas, a second layer of lightweight fabric was stretched. For the Papanine team, it was black satin. Why? Imagine 4 men inside the tent. They're breathing, boiling water on a Primus stove, and releasing steam. Where can this moisture go? Exactly. Immediately onto the walls. If the wall was just one layer of canvas, it would instantly frost over, forming an icy crust and becoming as hard as plywood. But they had 2 layers. Warm, moist air from inside passed through the light inner fabric and hit the icy canvas. The moisture froze instantly in the space between the layers. The interior satin tent stayed dry, while on the outer side, facing the canvas, a beautiful fluffy layer of frost, what we call hoarfrost, began to form. By morning, this frost could weigh several kilograms. It hung from the ceiling in long, shimmering strands. The first thing an expedition member did was take a special stick and tap the ceiling. The hoarfrost fell, was carefully collected with a broom, and carried outside. Simple, but brilliant. And the floor, obviously you can't sleep directly on the ice. The floor of the Papanine tent was also layered. First, a canvas sheet was laid on the ice, then a thick layer of wool felt, like a padding, and on top of that, reindeer skins. Lots of reindeer skins. They served as both a rug and a communal blanket. This created a kind of canvas tent inside a tent, with another soft fabric cocoon inside. In this cocoon, on the warm floor covered with skins, 4 folding beds were set up. But sleep was still far off. We need to address the main issue, the bed. And here we come to the most intimate part, the sleeping bag. Forget about down and synthetic insulation. In those times, the only material capable of retaining heat in the Arctic night was fur. And not just any fur, but reindeer fur. Why reindeer? Because it held a magical secret. Every hair of the reindeer's coat was hollow. It was a tiny tube sealed at both ends with air trapped inside. Millions of microscopic thermoses. No other type of fur provided such protection. Reindeer fur was completely waterproof and resistant to cold.
The best sleeping bags were sewn based on the clothing of northern peoples, Germans and Evenks. They called them sovik or kukul. Now imagine this. It wasn't just a simple bag, but a double bag, like a giant fur nesting doll. The first layer was fur turned inward, with the soft side facing the body. The second layer was fur turned outward. The result was a colossal furry matryoshka.
You slipped inside, and all around you was dense, thick reindeer fur. The people of the Papanen tribe crafted their bags from the Puchik reindeer, the youngest and softest of all. Such a bag weighed about 15 kilograms, and here we come back to the smell. Of course, the hides were processed, but the tanning wasn't exactly perfumed. It was a rough, greasy process. The inner side of the hide, called mizdra, had to stay elastic. It was impregnated with fat, and the smell of tanned hide, fat, and, forgive me, the reindeer itself, was reminiscent of an old barn. But to the polar explorer, it was the scent of life, the smell of warmth. Now, let's debunk a popular myth. People say that it's warmer to sleep naked in a sleeping bag. That's simply not true. No sane polar explorer would ever do that. It's tantamount to suicide. Here's why. Even during sleep, your body releases moisture through breathing. If you sleep naked, all that moisture directly soaks into the fur. The fur becomes soaked through. Over the course of a night, it freezes. Drying a 15-kilogram fur sleeping bag in Arctic conditions is nearly impossible. After just 3 or 4 nights, your luxurious sovik would turn into a 20-kilogram block of ice. That's why people sleep as if they were a cabbage. First, they wear wool underwear, naturally. It absorbs the initial moisture. Then, perhaps, an additional layer, a training suit, for example. Only then do they crawl into their sleeping bag. Yes, in the morning, that underwear is wet. But drying thin woolen clothing is much easier. It can be simply worn under the main clothes and dried on the body during the day while working, while the sacred sleeping bag remains dry. Now, let's describe the process of going to sleep. Imagine the evening at a tent, minus 35 degrees Celsius outside, and the wind howling. Thanks to a stove, the temperature inside can even reach minus 5 degrees, which is already a luxury. You take off your outer clothing, heavy armor-like garments, a parka or a sweater. You remain in your sleepwear. Your sleeping bag lies on a cot. It's stiff. Over the course of the day, it has absorbed some moisture, and the outer layer has frozen solid. It stands upright like a column. You don't just crawl into it, you break into it. You literally crack the icy crust at the entrance. The first 5 to 10 minutes are hell. You lie in this icy, rigid, odoriferous cocoon of hide. Not a single tooth touches another. You curl up into a ball, start breathing, and with your body heat, your normal 36.6 degrees Celsius, you must melt the ice. You need to warm the moisture inside the fur, turning it into liquid, then heat that moisture. These are agonizing minutes. But then, gradually, you feel the fur begin to come alive. It softens, and the warmth stops escaping. A wave of bliss envelops you. It's a dry, reliable animal warmth, greater than any synthetic insulation could offer. Even if a blizzard rages outside and the ice beneath the tent cracks, you're inside your personal, fragrant fur cocoon. To breathe, the bag was equipped with a special valve, or snout. Breathing directly into the bag was strictly forbidden. It would freeze from the inside immediately. Instead, you used the valve, or a breathing tube, ensuring your exhalations stayed outside, keeping your cozy, warm fur sanctuary safe and unfrozen. Breathing outward into the cold air, by morning this entire upper part of the sleeping bag and the tent itself would be coated with a thick layer of frost, not from your breath, but from the freezing environment. That's how a polar explorer's bedroom looked. The tent was like the outer layer of a cabbage, the sleeping bag like the inner layer, and the person inside was like a small, cozy ember in the middle. But lying down to sleep isn't just about slipping into a bag. What about dinner? Or, excuse me, the toilet? And who would listen to the cracking ice while you slept? These nightly rituals, the sacred flame of the Primus stove, and the reason why the station leader was the most important person in the tent. These are topics we'll explore in our third part. For now, rest and cherish your warm, soft, and most importantly, odorless bed that doesn't smell like reindeer. Let's rewind the film a couple of hours. Inside the tent, no one was asleep yet. All 4 polar explorers, and in the famous Papanyan tent, there were 4 of them, had finished their work outside and were now inside. In the center of this tiny canvas world, the Primus stove roared like a small dragon. It wasn't just a flame, it was the center of the universe, the heart of the camp. First of all, it was the god of warmth. Only thanks to it could the temperature inside the tent rise from the outdoor minus 40 degrees Celsius to maybe minus 10 or even 5 degrees. In such heat, it was possible to take off the heavy outer clothing, the parka, and stay in a sweater. Second, and most importantly, the Primus was the god of water. We're used to simply opening a tap and getting water. Here in the Arctic, there was no water. Surrounding the camp was the ocean, but it was salty and undrinkable. There were billions of tons of ice and snow around, but that was solid water. To drink it, you had to melt it. And that's where the main evening task began. It might seem simple now. You gather snow, throw it into a pot. But try it. Snow is mostly air. A huge bucket of fluffy, compacted snow placed on the Primus yields, at best, a cup of water at the bottom. To fill a kettle with that water, you had to constantly add new portions. The snow melts, hisses, steams. Then you add more snow, it melts again, and you keep replenishing it. It takes hours of monotonous work to produce a single kettle of boiling water. Ice was easier to handle. It was dense, but you first had to find it. You couldn't use old sea ice as it was often salty. Instead, explorers looked for icebergs or large frozen-over pressure ridges, breaking off chunks with harpoons, such tools called scoops. They brought these into the tent, chopped them into small pieces, and loaded them into the pot. This task of collecting water was sacred, usually assigned to the station leader, the Vaktini. Once the water was ready and the Primus roared, dinner began. This was the third form of that divine entity, the god of food. Hot food in the Arctic was more than just calories. It was morale. It was life itself. What did they eat? Mostly concentrates. Soup from compressed tablet-like blocks, porridge, and, of course, canned food. Stew and condensed milk were treats, and the famous pemmican. Pemmican was a high-calorie mixture of dried ground meat and melted fat. It didn't sound appealing, but a single such brick provided energy for half a day's work in the freezing cold. Now imagine the scene. Inside the tent, warmth surrounds 4 bearded men sitting around the roaring Primus. Bowls of steaming soup sit in front of them. The steam doesn't just rise to the ceiling, it immediately freezes, settling onto the tent's satin-like interior ceiling, which we mentioned last time. By morning, that steam would turn into those very kilograms, and the polar explorers joked that they ate in a dry state because all the moisture from the food evaporated right onto the ceiling. Eating had to be quick, very quick. Support Lectures Under the Moon by liking this video and subscribing for more in-depth explorations. If you hesitated, lost in thoughts of home, your stove in the tent would first turn your hot meal into a mush,
and then into a solid block of ice.
So the Primus stove. Its warmth, water, and food. Its life itself. But, as I mentioned, this god had a dark, devilish side. First, the Primus was fire, an open flame inside a canvas tent where everything, clothing, sleeping bags, and even the walls were coated with grease, soot, and, you remember, the scent of reindeer. A single careless spark or a knocked-over burner, and this small, cozy house would ignite like a gunpowder barrel. It was a constant, looming threat hanging over your head like a sword. Second, there was carbon monoxide. The Primus burned kerosene and consumed oxygen. Inside the tent, which was carefully sealed and all gaps were stuffed to retain precious heat, this tiny dragon could quietly devour all the air. Carbon monoxide is a silent killer. It has no smell, and from it, you simply start to feel drowsy. And that was the most terrifying nightmare in the Arctic. No matter how cold it was, no matter how fierce the blizzard, a small ventilation hole was always left open in the tent. It was a constant balancing act between warmth and life. And third, this device would break down. On the cold, kerosene thickened into a gel, clogging the nozzles, and to ignite the stove, it often had to be warmed by bare hands. Touching metal with bare skin at -40 degrees Celsius was a guaranteed frostbite burn. So, after dinner, the affair with the devilish Primus was settled. Everyone was fed, and the tent was relatively warm. Then came the most awkward, yet most vital question of the Arctic night. Sorry for the raw honesty. The bathroom. Imagine you've almost warmed up, sipped hot tea, and feel cozy. Yet beyond the canvas wall, the temperature drops to -40, and the wind strips your strength, making you feel like you might fall over. What do? Crawl out of that warm tent into this hell? That meant a full operation. Putting on boots or insulated slippers, slipping into a fur coat, donning a hat and gloves. It took about 15 minutes, and then you had to dash into the darkness, if it was polar night and snowstorm. For small needs, there was, let's say, a waste bucket, usually placed in the tent's vestibule in the coldest corner. Unhygienic, unpleasant, but necessary. For more serious matters, you had to get dressed properly, which was dangerous. The main rule for polar explorers was never to wander far from the tent during a snowstorm. You could get lost within 10 paces. Literally, you take 10 steps, turn around, and the tent is already gone, replaced by white, howling fog. That's why they went out in pairs, or at least tied together with a rope, one end firmly attached to the tent. That moment of complete vulnerability, exposed to the biting cold, was terrifying. No time to sit and think. Everything had to be done lightning fast. And finally, all the rituals were completed. The water for the morning was boiled and stored in thermoses, dinner was eaten, and the waste bucket was used. 3 polar explorers, as we already know, crawl into their icy sleeping bags and begin to revive them. But one does not sleep. This is the last, and perhaps most crucial, nightly ritual. The watch. There was always a guard in the camp, someone on duty. They usually took turns every 3 or 4 hours. While 3 were sleeping, 1 stayed awake. What did they do? First, they listened to the camp. They sat in silence and listened. They listened to the ice. Had the dreaded shift already begun? Did the ice crack? They listened to the wind, its tone, its change. They listened to the silence. Was there any crunching under the paws of a polar bear? Their rifle was always close by. Second, they were the firekeeper. They monitored the Primus, kept it alive, and refilled the kerosene as needed. Everything in this tiny Arctic world depended on these routines. Constant vigilance in the face of deadly cold and lurking danger. He begins by melting a fresh batch of ice for the morning tea, so that upon waking, the team can immediately enjoy a hot drink. Moreover, he is a scientist. He steps out into the cold to check the instruments, recording readings every few hours regardless of the weather. And this was the most demanding part of the night. Sleeping inside a fur bag is, after all, warm. But sitting still for 3 hours, even dressed in warm clothing at -5 degrees Celsius, was enough to send a chill to the bones. The watchman constantly moved his fingers and toes, trying to prevent frostbite. Yet, thanks to him, this single person who refused to sleep, the other 3 could afford to drift into sleep peacefully. They slept soundly because they knew their lives, their warmth, and their safety were under reliable protection. And so, when our hero, the polar explorer, had completed his watch, he woke his companion, handed over the Primus stove and the rifle, and finally, with full right, could crawl into his sleeping bag. That was it. Nightly duties done. Now only sleep remained. But what happens to the human body when it tries to rest in such cold? How does it fight? And why, as they fall asleep, are polar explorers most afraid of sweating? We will discuss this art, this physiology of sleep, in our 4th part. It might seem absurd, -40 outside, maybe -10 inside the tent. You lie in an icy bag that needs warming. You dream of warmth. How can you possibly sweat in this situation? Yet, here lies the main cunning paradox of the Arctic night. Let's observe how our body functions. When we are cold, we shiver. This is an involuntary, rapid contraction of muscles. Why? To generate heat. Our internal stove kicks into full gear. When the polar explorer climbs into the icy bag, he shivers intensely for the first 10 to 15 minutes. So much so that it seems he might fall off the cot. And that's good. It's a natural process. The body fights back. And here lies the trap. In this struggle for warmth, it's very easy to overdo it. For example, a person, fearing to freeze, might put on too many layers of clothing. Or he might vigorously move and adjust inside the bag, straining himself so much that his internal heater becomes red hot. At some point, when the bag has warmed up and the heat inertia is still working, the body, trying to cool down, begins to perspire, something it always does when it needs to. And that is a catastrophe, because sweat is moisture, water. And, as physics teaches us, water conducts heat 25 times better than air. Imagine stepping out of a river on a cool day. You instantly feel cold, even if the sun was warm. Now multiply that effect by Arctic conditions. Suddenly, all the clothes, all the underwear that was just dry and warm, becomes soaked and sticky. And immediately, in that very second, it begins to freeze. The fur lining inside the bag, which should have been warming with dry heat, turns into a damp, icy cloth. And that's it. The heat transfer becomes monstrous. The body starts losing warmth not gradually, but in an avalanche. Someone who was just minutes ago sweating from the cold now begins to be covered from within with an icy crust. And no sleeping bag or reindeer hide can save him anymore. He finds himself in an icy trap he has created himself. That's why the greatest art of sleeping in the cold is about finding the delicate balance. Wearing just enough woolen underwear to absorb the natural night sweat without letting it turn into sweat that causes cooling. A small amount of moisture is always produced by the body, but it must never lead to sweating. They had to learn, forgive the expression, how to manage their shivering. If you shiver, good, warm the bag. When you start to warm up, relax, breathe evenly, and don't let your body overheat. It's all about controlling that fine line, balancing between the chill and the heat, and knowing exactly how much wool to wear to stay dry and warm through the long, cold night. Support Lectures Under the Moon with a like. It helps the channel grow. Now, as the night deepens, the mind begins to drift, and the body's battle against the cold continues. Each shiver a reminder of the fragile balance required to survive in this frozen wilderness. This was not a dream. It was work. The second physiological battle was with breathing itself. When we are cold, what do we instinctively do? We hide our noses under the blanket, craving to wrap ourselves completely and hide our heads. But for a polar explorer, that was absolutely forbidden. Why? Because our breathing creates nearly 100% humidity. Try breathing onto a glass in the cold. It instantly fogs up with frost. Now imagine a polar explorer stuffing his head inside a fur sack. Over the course of a single night, he would exhale perhaps a glass of water into it. This luxurious, warm, fur-lined bag would then be coated on the inside with a dense, hard layer of ice. By dawn, his cocoon would have transformed into an icy burrow. That's why the rule was absolute: breathe outward. But how does one do that? Outward, I remind you, means facing a temperature of -10 degrees Celsius. That meant the entire face was exposed to the cold. So how did they sleep? As we recall, the bags were equipped with special valves, hoods or fur-lined hoods, designed so that only the nose and mouth protruded. Often, they breathed through a woolen scarf or a special mask. The moisture from their breath would settle and freeze on the scarf, on the collar of the sack, or anywhere outside the bag, never inside. And by morning, that's a story all its own, everything had turned into a layer of ice. The mustache and beard would be frozen stiffly to this icy shell. But that wasn't even the worst part. The most dangerous risk to the body during sleep was insidious frostbite. The body is clever, but ruthlessly efficient. When it becomes critically cold, it enters a survival mode for the core. It decides the brain, heart, and lungs are more important, while the toes, ears, and nose can be sacrificed. Blood flow to the extremities is cut off. Blood vessels narrow to conserve heat in the center of the body. What does this mean for a sleeping person? You're asleep, so you don't feel pain. You don't notice how your toes start to tingle, then go numb, and finally die. You simply sleep. And in the morning, you crawl out of your sack to find that instead of 10 toes, you have 10 white, hard, dead pieces of ice. That's why polar explorers always tried never to sleep alone. Yes, each had his own cot inside the tent, but in mountaineering or in extreme situations, the only way to survive was through collective sleeping. It wasn't just about lying side by side. It was a complex technique. Special double and even triple sleeping bags were sewn, gigantic, fur-lined envelopes. Imagine 3 men crawling into one of these bags. One human body is like a stove, but 3? That's, forgive me, a boiler. They heated this bag so effectively that no frost was threatening. The person lying in the middle was the filling of the pie, warmer than anyone else. Those on the sides were the crust. One side was warm from the neighbor's body, while the other was cold from the wall of the bag. And then, like soldiers receiving an order in the dead of night, they would turn over without waking. 1, 2, 3. They'd rotate to warm the other side. It was not only about warmth, it was about control. If you sleep in the same bag with a comrade, you can slip your freezing feet under his knees. He might grumble, but you'll save your toes. If suddenly your neighbor stops shivering, a very bad sign, it means his body has surrendered, relaxed suspiciously, and fallen silent. You'll notice it. You'll shake him, make him move.
you won't let him die in his sleep. As you see, the entire night was not a rest. It was a continuous, complex physiological challenge. Managing heat, moisture, breathing, monitoring each other was the real task. They fought against the cold, not with fear, but through discipline and cunning. And now, imagine, our hero has succeeded. He has found balance. He does not sweat. He breathes out properly. His fingers are warm. He sleeps embraced by his companion. He is dry and he is warm. It seems like a victory. Yet, suddenly, in the middle of the night, his entire bed, this 3-meter-thick ice floe, splits apart with a deafening crash. Black, oily water from the ocean is now just a meter from his sleeping bag. What to grab?
Where to run? We will discuss how to sleep when your bedroom might collapse at any moment in our 5th part. In the 1st part, we talked about the sounds of ice, about how they frightened newcomers. But a truly experienced polar explorer does not fear these sounds. He reads them. He sleeps, but part of his brain, like a highly sensitive detector, continues to listen and analyze. He already knows that this dry, sharp crack, resembling a gunshot, this is nothing to worry about. It's simply a frost crack somewhere above. The ice has stretched. He can continue sleeping. He understands that this low, vibrating hum or moan is the shifting of the ice field, but somewhere far away, kilometers away. The ice floes rub against each other like giant millstones, but that does not yet threaten his shelter. And what he truly fears, what he waits for with all his heart, is the screech. Not just cracking, but a growing screech that transitions into a roar. A sound like someone trying to bend a colossal sheet of metal. That noise signals one thing: compression. It is the polar explorer's worst nightmare, not the one in his head, but the one outside, in the environment. Let's analyze what could have happened to his bed. There are basically 2 scenarios, and both are bad. The first, rupture. Your ice floe is not monolithic. It's simply a large chunk of frozen water. Under the influence of currents, winds, and tides, it experiences colossal stress, and at some point, it just cracks apart. Sometimes this happens almost silently. The explorer wakes up because the tent suddenly feels cooler, or because a fellow worker screams in a voice that's not human. They rush outside and see a polynya, an open water area, black, oily, steaming. Of course, it's not smoke, but steam. The water is warm, just a few degrees above freezing, compared to the -40 outside. A strip of open water. And this polynya, this crack, could be anywhere. 10 meters from the tent, 5 meters, or, heaven forbid, between tents. You sleep here, but your supplies and kerosene are on another piece of ice, slowly drifting into the darkness. Or, even worse, you are here, and your dogs, your only draft animals, are somewhere else. The desperate race begins. Before the crack widens too much, you must throw planks, skis, harnesses across it to rescue your supplies and fuel. Every box of ration packs, every can of kerosene is a matter of life and death. But a rupture, a crack, strangely enough, is only half the problem. An ice floe can be sewn back together, or you can simply accept the loss and live on what remains. The true nightmare is called taroshchenia. It's compression. It occurs when icy fields do not drift apart, but instead press against each other. Imagine 2 continents in miniature colliding in a violent clash. Ice 2, 3, 4 meters thick cannot withstand this monstrous pressure and begins to fracture. It shatters like a wafer, The edges of the floes rise on their edges, and here, no longer just cracks, there are roars and crashes. Massive, multi-ton blocks of ice, the size of a car or bus, are pushed upward. They slide and screech against each other, forming entire ridges of ice. These ridges are what we call taros, and this could happen right over your camp. Let's remember our Papanenets. In early February of 1938, their ice floe, which at the time of landing was a colossal airstrip stretching 3 kilometers long, had already shrunk to the size of a football field. And then it began. A storm, wind, snow blizzard, and the ice started moving. Radio operator Ernst Krenkel later broadcast, "As a result of a 6-day storm, on the night of the 1st of February, the ice field split apart." What did that mean in practice? They woke up to a terrifying tremor and a loud cracking sound, rushing out of their tents. Right through their camp, just dozens of meters from their living tent, a fissure had opened. And nearby, very close, an icy ridge was beginning to form. The ice was climbing over the ice. Ivan Popa, the station chief, issued a command, "Quote 0. In the darkness, by the light of pocket flashlights, amid the raging blizzard, they scrambled to transfer everything. They moved their instruments, which weighed hundreds of kilograms, barrels of fuel, sacks of food, to the largest, most stable piece of their former ice floe. Their beds were falling apart before their eyes. The ice floe shattered into pieces. When the storm finally subsided, they saw that their island was now only about 200 by 300 meters, surrounded by chaos. Up-thrusted ice hummocks and open water. How can you sleep, knowing this could happen at any moment? The answer? You can't. Not like us. This was not sleep. It was a mode of waiting. First, as we remember, there was always a lookout. He was the first to hear danger and raise the alarm. Second, each polar explorer had, at the head of his cot, an emergency backpack or a survival kit, an inviolable reserve. This was sacred. It was prepared every evening before sleep. What was inside? Only the essentials. The holy trinity of survival. The first, food. The most calorie-rich, including chocolate, sugar, and pemmican bars, things you could swallow on the run that would give you energy. Second, tools. Waterproof matches, life itself. A hunting knife, a compass. Third, warmth. Extra woolen socks, spare gloves. The first rule when alarmed was, quote 1. And the third rule for sleeping on the ice was, you never undressed completely. You slept in your wool sleeping suit, and your boots, or valenki, your footwear, were not put aside somewhere, but right next to your cot, so that you could, jumping out of your sleeping bag, slip your feet into them immediately. A second of delay, and you'd be left barefoot on the ice. And that is certain death. Sleeping on a drifting ice floe was like sleeping on a minefield or an active volcano. You never relaxed. You lay in your sleeping bag, warming it, but every cell of your body was serving a purpose. It listened to the ice, to the wind, to the silence. And now, imagine, this terrible night passed. The ice calmed down. A vent hole in the tent let through a dull, gray dawn. The lookout, having finished his shift, finally yells, "Quote 2!" And then the polar explorer faced the last, most unpleasant test. What is it like to wake up when your eyelashes and mustache are frozen stiff to the fur collar of your sleeping bag? We'll talk about that, and about the joy of the first sip of morning tea in our concluding 6th part. Rise and shine! That cry from the lookout, echoing in the freezing air of the tent, is perhaps the most hated and simultaneously most cherished sound in the world. hated because it ruthlessly pulls you out of the fragile, life-saving slumber, and cherished because it means __quote _3__. The ice sheet hadn't completely broken apart. The bear still hadn't arrived, and you hadn't turned into an ice statue. You had survived another night, yet now you try to open your eyes and find yourself unable. Or, more accurately, you do open them, but something strange is holding them shut. You attempt to blink, but your eyelashes produce a faint, dry, cracking sound. This is the moment we have been waiting for. What does it feel like to wake up when your eyelashes and mustache are frozen solid to the fur collar of your sleeping bag? This is precisely what we discussed.
Throughout the night, you breathed outward, as is customary, and every warm exhalation immediately settled and froze onto everything near your face. The fur collar, the scarf wrapping your nose, and, of course, your eyelashes, eyebrows, beard, and mustache. By morning, this entire furry fringe had transformed into a solid, icy shell, and you found yourself literally embedded within it. What should you do? Pulling at it is absolutely out of the question. You would tear your skin apart. And so begins the first morning ritual. You're still lying inside your bag, but already awake. Carefully, you slip a mitten onto your hand. It's, of course, also icy, but still. And you start to melt the little ice patch. You press your finger against the frozen eyelashes through the mitten and hold it there. Using your body heat, you slowly, millimeter by millimeter, melt this icy glue. Or, with your lips pressed tight, you try to breathe warm air onto it. This process takes several minutes.
The morning begins with a literal struggle to peel yourself from the bed. But that's only the first problem. The second is to get out of the tent. Understand, inside your fur cocoon, which you've kept warm all night with your body, now it's almost like a resort. Perhaps even a spa. Or, if you're lucky enough to sleep with someone, everything is +5. But in the tent, which was broken out of by the cry, "Get up! 30 seconds! Primus, of course, is already roaring. The watchman turned it off, but it hasn't yet heated the tent." Climbing out of the warm, relatively cozy sleeping bag into the 20-degree frost inside your own shelter is a small daily feat. It's like jumping from a hot bath directly into a January snowdrift. Every morning, without exception. Experienced polar explorers do it with one swift, desperate motion. No slowly sticking out a leg. You take a deep breath, brace yourself, and suddenly burst out of the bag, landing immediately onto the floor made of reindeer skins. And what do you see around you? The atmosphere inside the tent is both magical and eerie. Remember, all night moisture had condensed on the ceiling. Now, that entire dark satin ceiling is covered with thick, fluffy silver frost. It hangs in long garlands, like something from a fairy tale palace. When you make that sudden movement, the frost flakes off. A whole snowfall. It showers down onto your head, onto your shoulders, onto your face. Cold, prickly, like tiny shards of broken glass. The air inside the tent is thick with mist from your breath, mixed with smoke and the smell of kerosene from the Primus stove. First thing, you must get dressed, quickly, fast, before you become numb. You pull on that damp wool underwear that now has to dry on your body, then a sweater, trousers, and your boots. Your traditional boots, or felt-lined shoes that sat beside your bunk overnight, have turned into 2 wooden clogs. They're hard as stone. You need to break them apart. You grab them, squeeze, bang them against each other, trying to restore their shape so you can force your foot inside. And while our hero, shivering from the cold, fights with his felt boots, let's momentarily return to the state of drowsiness from which he was so rudely ripped. What did these people dream of? Do you think it was the polar night, the howling wind, the cracking ice? They used to dream of adventures, battles with bears, heroic feats. Or so they thought.
In 99% of cases, the polar explorers only dreamed of food. They would later record in their journals, "Today I dreamed of fried potatoes, a whole skillet with onions sizzling. Or I saw a huge, sweet, red, crunchy watermelon. Or simply bread. Soft, warm, rye bread with a crispy crust." Their bodies, operating at absolute limit and constantly fighting for calories, demanded energy, and their brains responded in sleep as best they could. These edible dreams were both a torment and a salvation. Torment because waking up meant a lump of pemmican, and relief because they provided incredible moral relief. And finally, our polar explorer is dressed. He has defeated the Valenki. He has shaken off the snow. He is trembling so badly that his teeth are chattering. And then, the duty officer, who had been working at the roaring stove all this time, extends to him a steaming iron mug. Inside is tea, or, more honestly, murky boiling water with a pinch of tea leaves floating in it, and a large, precious chunk of sugar. The first sip. It's not just a hot drink. It's life itself. It's pure happiness. You take a sip, and the boiling water, burning, sinks into you, and you feel the warmth of a fiery stream spreading through your body, reaching your stomach, flowing through your veins to your hands and feet. You physically feel your fingers returning, the chattering teeth stopping. That's it. You're alive again. You're human once more, ready for another day on this cursed yet beautiful ice floe. That's how each night, each day, hundreds of nights went by. We, friends, have traveled this entire journey, from the initial psychological shock on the drifting island to icy eyelashes and the joy of that hot drink. How did this experience change people?
Oh, it changed them forever. When they returned to the mainland, to Moscow, to Leningrad, to their warm apartments, strange things would happen to them. Ernst Krenkel, the legendary radio operator of the Papans, remembered that when they stayed at the luxurious Metropole Hotel, he couldn't sleep all night. He was laid in a real bed with a mattress, crisp, clean sheets, and a warm blanket. But he kept tossing and turning, unable to close his eyes. Do you know why? It was too quiet. He missed the sounds, the distant cracking of ice, the howling wind, the creak of the stove. He longed for the feeling of a comrade breathing nearby, the faint snores of someone sleeping beside him. His body, his brain, used to sleeping on guard for hundreds of nights, couldn't relax in this absolute silence and comfort. It was waiting for trouble. They found it too hot to sleep in the rooms. They would open the windows wide in any frost, causing horror among their loved ones.
They had forgotten how to sleep in darkness during the polar day, or, conversely, they couldn't get used to the brightness after the polar night. They returned changed, people who now knew the true, raw value of the simplest things, the price of a matchstick, the worth of a dry sock, the value of a mug of hot water. They had learned to sleep on the most uncomfortable, dangerous, and lively bed on the planet, proving that even in icy hell, a person can create a small, warm, cozy home scented with reindeer. And so, our long story, our icy mattress, comes to an end. I sincerely hope it was cozy and warm for you to listen to in your soft, safe bed. May your sleep be deep, peaceful, and above all, quiet, without any creaking of ice outside your window. Good night. Thank you for watching Lectures Under the Moon with Daniel Hayes. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more fascinating stories.